So, what if a community had this amazing reputation for being vibrant and full of life, but on the inside it was actually dead? It sounds wild, but that's the exact diagnosis given to a church in the ancient city of Sardis, almost 2,000 years ago. In this explainer, we're going to decode this really powerful message from the book of Revelation, and we'll do it through the eyes of the very first Christian scholars who really dug into its meaning. This is the question that kicks the whole thing off, a real paradox that cuts right to the heart of the problem in Sardis. And we're not talking about physical life and death here, of course. This is all about spiritual vitality. It's asking a pretty uncomfortable question. Is it possible to look totally alive on the outside while being completely hollowed out and dead on the inside? All right, let's start with that diagnosis. The church in Sardis, by all accounts, had a great reputation. If you were looking from the outside, you'd think, wow, that place is thriving, it's active, it's alive. But the message they got was a total shock to the system. Spiritually, they were dead. And this really lays it bare, right? The massive gap between their public image and their actual reality. On one hand, everyone sees a thriving community, but on the other, the reality is a spiritual flatline. That was the core of their issue. So you have to wonder, what did being spiritually dead actually mean to these early Christian thinkers? Well, an early church father, Victorinus of Petovium, he really hit the nail on the head. He argued that their faith had just become a label. They called themselves Christians, sure, but their actions, their works, they just didn't back it up. You know, it's like a tree that looks perfectly healthy but just doesn't produce any fruit. Their identity had become totally hollow. So, if the diagnosis is spiritual death, what were the actual symptoms? Let's take a look at how these ancient commentators broke down what was really going wrong with the church in Sardis. The first symptom, according to a commentator named Oecumenius, was pretty straightforward: sin. He explains that in biblical language, being dead was this powerful metaphor for being trapped, or as he puts it, snared by sin. This wasn't about a lack of energy or enthusiasm. It was about being held captive by behaviors that went against everything they said they believed. And then the scholar Bede adds this other really fascinating layer to the diagnosis: a failure in leadership. He argued that the church's leader, probably their bishop, just wasn't correcting the wrongdoing he saw. Now, even if the leader himself was guiltless, his failure to guide and to, enliven his community, that made him complicit. He was part of the problem. Okay, so let's just pull that all together for a second. The diagnosis was pretty grim. You've got a community that was Christian in name only, totally empty of good works, enslaved to sin, and, to top it all off, suffering from negligent leadership. It's a really powerful and complete picture of what spiritual decay looked like to these early thinkers. But, a diagnosis is useless without a prescription, right? This wasn't just about condemning them. It was an urgent wake-up call. And the message gave them a clear, actionable path to come back to life. The commentator Apringius of Beja lays out this really clear 4-step treatment plan. First, be vigilant. Basically, wake up and start paying attention. Second, remember what you were first taught. Get back to the core teachings. Third, obey those teachings. And finally, number 4, repent of your past sins. It's a direct, challenging path back to spiritual health. And this is where the urgency really kicks in. This wasn't some gentle suggestion. Ignoring this prescription was going to have severe and very sudden consequences. And there it is, the famous thief in the night metaphor. As commentator Andrew of Caesarea explained it, this meant judgment would be swift and totally unexpected for anyone who wasn't ready. For those who were spiritually awake, it'd be a welcome end to their struggles. But for those in Sardis who stayed dead, it would be the final, irreversible end. But the story doesn't end on that dark note, not at all, because even in this dying church, there was a glimmer of hope. The message pivots from this dire warning to focus on a small group who had actually managed to stay spiritually alive. And this is so important to understand. The diagnosis wasn't a blanket condemnation of every single person. Even within this struggling community, there was a faithful remnant, a few people who had kept themselves pure and hadn't compromised their faith. Bede offers such a powerful insight here. The original message says, God knew this group by name, not just as some nameless few. And Bede connects this to the idea of a deeply personal relationship. God doesn't just see a crowd, he knows each faithful person individually, just like a shepherd who knows every single one of his sheep by name. So what about this phrase, unsoiled garments? What does that even mean? Well, Oecumenius and Apringius saw this as a really strong metaphor. It represented inner purity, a life that had not been stained by the filth of sin. It meant their actions and their inner life were clean, that they were walking the talk. So, for this fateful remnant, for those who conquered the pressures all around them, a huge reward was promised. An essential part of that promise was being clothed in white robes. And what's so fascinating is how these early thinkers saw all these different layers of meaning in this one single image. For Tertullian, the white robes symbolized the future resurrection of the body. For Oecumenius, it was a sign of their present purity. And for Bede, it represented the purity of their baptism, a commitment they had kept unstained their entire lives. But the ultimate reward was, well, it was even greater than that. Oecumenius explains that the real promise was to be publicly acknowledged by Christ himself in the highest court of heaven, to have your name spoken as a faithful servant before the Father and all the angels. That was the ultimate validation, the ultimate prize for a faith that was real, not just a reputation. And all of this leaves us with a question that is just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. In a world that's so focused on reputation and appearances, on what things look like, how does anyone, whether you're religious or not, live a life of integrity? A life where our actions actually match our deepest held values. A life that is truly more than just a name.